Something really strange happens when a person starts to wake up spiritually. And when I say waking up, I don't mean having some huge, mind-blowing mystical experience, or suddenly achieving enlightenment like you see in movies. Bathed in golden light, all your problems vanish. No, I'm talking about something much more subtle and in many ways a lot more unsettling. I'm talking about that moment when you start to see through the bull, when the curtain starts to pull back, and you realize that a lot of what you've been told is real and important is actually just a big, elaborate story. And here's the thing nobody tells you. Once you see through it, you can't unsee it. There are things you lose when you wake up that you can never get back. Not because someone takes them away from you, but because they just kind of dissolve once you realize what they really were all along. Illusions, games, agreed-upon fantasies that only work as long as everyone pretends they're real. The first thing you lose, and it's probably the most disorienting, is your ability to take the social game seriously. Now, I don't mean you turn into a jerk or start being rude. What I mean is that you can't really participate in the whole social charade with the same level of sincere enthusiasm you used to have. You see people scrambling for status, competing to get noticed, carefully building up their image, and you can see right through it. You see it as a kind of dance, a ritual that everyone has agreed to perform. And the spell is broken. Before you woke up, you were probably happy to join in the dance. You cared about your reputation, your social standing, what people thought about you. You played the game because everyone else was playing it, and it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. But once you wake up, you see the game for what it is, a game. And here's the thing about games. Once you recognize them as games, they lose their power over you. You might still play along, but you're no longer tricked into thinking the game is real life. I remember watching people at parties after I started to see through this particular illusion. The conversations about who had achieved what, who knew whom, who had been recognized or promoted or honored. It all seemed like kids playing dress-up, taking their make-believe way too seriously. And I'm not saying this to sound superior. Believe me. I'm not suggesting I was better than these people. I'm just describing what happens when you see through the game. You lose the ability to care about it the way you once did. And that loss has consequences. Your old friends might think you're weird now. They can tell you're not playing by the same rules anymore, that you're not impressed by the things that impress them, that you don't share their worries about status and position. They might accuse you of having changed, of becoming distant or arrogant, but you haven't become arrogant. You've just stopped pretending that the emperor's wearing clothes when you can clearly see he's buck naked. The second thing you lose is your innocence about why people do what they do. Before you woke up, you probably took people at their word. When someone said something, you generally believed they meant it. When someone acted friendly, you assumed they were friendly. When someone claimed to believe in something, you thought they actually believed it. But as you wake up, you start to see what's going on beneath the surface. You see how much of what people say and do is driven by fear, by a desperate need to be liked, by unconscious patterns they don't even know they have. You start to notice the difference between what people say they value and how they actually act. You see someone give a beautiful speech about compassion and kindness, and then you watch them treat a waiter like dirt. You hear people talking about how important truth and honesty are, and then you see them lying to themselves with every breath they take. You notice how people come up with elaborate excuses for doing exactly what they wanted to do anyway. This isn't a comfortable thing to see. In fact, it can be pretty painful because you also start to see these patterns in yourself. You realize how much of your own behavior has been driven by unconscious fear and need. You catch yourself in the middle of fooling yourself. You notice how often your high-minded reasons for doing things are really just ways to cover up much more basic desires. The desire to be liked, to feel safe, to avoid discomfort. Once you've seen this, you can't unsee it. And that means you lose a certain kind of trust in human nature, or maybe more accurately, a certain naivete about it. In a way, you become impossible to fool. Not because you've become cynical. Cynicism is just another kind of belief, after all, but because you've developed a sort of X-ray vision for phoniness and self-deception. The third thing you lose, and this is maybe the biggest one, is your belief in the idea that you're a solid, unchanging person. Before you woke up, you probably thought of yourself as a continuous thing moving through time, the same person you were yesterday, the same person you'll be tomorrow, with a consistent set of qualities, preferences, and characteristics that define who you are. But as you start to wake up, This sense of a solid, continuous self starts to fall apart. You realize that what you call yourself is really just a collection of thoughts, memories, sensations, and patterns that are constantly changing. You catch yourself being different people in different situations, not because you're being fake, but because there's no fixed person to be true to. The self you thought was so real and permanent turns out to be more like a river than a rock. Always flowing, never the same from one moment to the next. This is incredibly disorienting because if there's no solid self, then who's living your life? Who's making your decisions? Who's experiencing your experiences? Your mind freaks out at this idea. It really wants to believe in the reality of the self, because without that belief, everything becomes uncertain. If there's no solid me, then what's the point of anything? Why should I care about what happens to this body and mind if there's no real person here anyway? But here's the interesting thing. Once you lose your belief in the solid self, you can't get it back. Even if you want to, you might try to convince yourself that you're a real, solid person again, but you've seen through it. You know it's just another story, another convenient fiction. And that knowing changes everything, because so much of human suffering is based on the desperate attempt to protect and promote a self that doesn't actually exist in the way we think it does. The fourth thing you lose is your ability to believe that your own story is the most important thing in the world. Every person creates a story about their life, where they came from, what happened to them, what it all means, where they're going. This story gives life a sense of order and purpose. It turns the random events of life into a meaningful tale with heroes and villains, triumphs and tragedies, lessons learned and wisdom gained. Before you woke up, your story was probably really important to you. It defined you. It explained you. It justified you. When people asked who you were, you told them your story. When you thought about yourself, you went over your story in your head. The story gave meaning to your suffering and made your achievements feel important. But as you wake up, you start to see your story as just that. A story, a tale created after the fact to make sense of what happened. And you realize that you could tell the same events in a completely different way and create a totally different story. The facts stay the same, but the meaning changes depending on how you frame them. What you once saw as your greatest victory might be reinterpreted as your biggest mistake. What you thought was your deepest wound might be seen as your greatest teacher. Once you recognize that your story is just one possible way of looking at your life, not the absolute truth of your life, you can't quite believe in it the same way anymore. It becomes more like a costume you wear than a true expression of who you really are. And that means you lose the comfort and security that comes from having a strong identity based on a consistent story. You become, in a way, storyless. Not because you stop telling stories about yourself, but because you know they're just stories. The fifth thing you lose is your ability to get your sense of meaning and purpose from things outside yourself, like goals and achievements. Before you woke up, you probably planned your life around achieving things, getting an education, building a career, finding a partner, raising kids, getting rich, collecting things, or having amazing experiences. These goals gave your life direction and purpose. They gave you a reason to get out of bed in the morning, a way to measure your progress, a reason to feel like your life was worthwhile. But as you wake up, you start to see through the whole idea of achievement. You realize that every achievement is temporary, that everything you build will eventually fall apart, that everyone will forget your accomplishments. You see that the satisfaction of achieving something never lasts. The minute you achieve something, your mind is already reaching for the next goal, never satisfied, never complete. More than that, you start to question the whole idea of trying to become something, of trying to get somewhere other than where you are. You realize that all the striving is based on the idea that you're not good enough as you are, that life isn't good enough as it is, that something is missing or wrong that needs to be fixed, achieved, or gotten. And you realize that this idea is what causes so much suffering. Once you see this, you can't really throw yourself into chasing goals with the same complete conviction you used to have. You might still work, still create, still build things, but it feels different. You're not doing it to become someone or to prove something or to fill a hole inside you. You're doing it because it's the natural thing to do in the moment, not because you think it will finally make you whole. The sixth thing you lose is your fear of what other people think of you. At least, you lose it in that old, crippling way. Now, you don't stop caring about other people's opinions completely. That would make you a sociopath. What you lose is that desperate, unconscious need for approval that drives so much of your behavior. Before you woke up, you lose that automatic assumption that other people's opinions of you are somehow more real or true than your own experience of yourself. Before you woke up, you probably spent a lot of energy managing your image, trying to control what other people thought of you, changing your behavior to get approval or avoid disapproval. This was exhausting, of course, but it seemed necessary because other people's opinions felt incredibly important, even like they defined who you were. But as you wake up, you realize that what other people think of you is really just what they think of the story they've created about you, which has very little to do with who you actually are. You see that people's judgments say a lot more about them than they do about you. You realize that trying to get everyone to like you is a game you can never win, because even when you get their approval, it's never quite enough, and they can take it away at any moment. Once you see this clearly, you can't go back to desperately seeking approval. You might still enjoy it when people like you, but you don't need it in the same way. You can't be controlled by the threat of disapproval anymore, because you've seen through the illusion that other people's opinions determine your worth. The seventh thing you lose is your ability to hate or blame in that old self-righteous way. Before you woke up, you probably had strong ideas about who was good and who was bad, who was right and who was wrong. When people hurt you or others, you felt justified in your anger and condemnation. You believed in villains and victims, in evil people who deserved to be punished. But as you wake up, you start to see that everyone is acting based on their conditioning, their wounds, their fears. You see that the person who hurt you is themselves hurt. That cruelty comes from suffering. That ignorance isn't the same thing as evil. You realize that if you had the same conditioning and circumstances, you might very well do the same things they did. You see that judging and condemning people doesn't actually help anything. It just creates more suffering, more division, more conflict. This doesn't mean you become passive when someone is causing harm. You might still work to stop destructive behavior, to protect yourself and others, but you do it without the hatred, without the self-righteous condemnation, without the belief that you're fighting evil. You do it with a kind of sad understanding that suffering creates suffering, and that breaking this cycle requires something other than more hatred and blame. Once you've seen this, you can't go back to that simple morality of good guys and bad guys. You lose your capacity for self-righteous hatred. And this can be disorienting because hatred often gave you energy, clarity, a sense of purpose. Without it, you have to find a different way of responding to the harm and ignorance in the world. The eighth thing you lose is your need to be consistent. Before you woke up, you probably worked hard to keep your image consistent. If you thought of yourself as a kind person, you felt like you had to always act kindly. If you saw yourself as intelligent, you couldn't let yourself look foolish. If you believed certain things, you felt like you had to defend those beliefs even when you started to doubt them. But as you wake up, you realize that this need for consistency is just another way of imprisoning yourself. You see that it's perfectly normal to contradict yourself, to change your mind, to be different in different situations. You realize that only dead things are completely consistent. Life is messy, contradictory, constantly changing. Once you see this, you can't stay rigid about being consistent. You become comfortable with paradox, with not knowing, with allowing yourself to be different today than you were yesterday. And this means you lose the security that comes from having a fixed position, a solid identity, a consistent set of beliefs to stand on. The ninth thing you lose is your tolerance for shallow conversation. Before you woke up, you could probably have endless conversations about unimportant things. The weather, sports, celebrities, small complaints, and observations. These conversations were a way to connect with people, to pass the time, to keep things friendly. They didn't need much depth, vulnerability, or honesty. But as you wake up, you find it harder and harder to join in these kinds of surface-level chats. It's not because you're being judgmental or thinking you're better than everyone else, but because you've experienced something deeper, and the shallow stuff just doesn't cut it anymore. You want to talk about real things, the nature of existence, the meaning of suffering, what it means to be human. You want a genuine connection, not just polite small talk. This can make social situations difficult, because most people aren't interested in or comfortable with the kind of depth you're looking for. They want to keep things light and comfortable. And so you often find yourself either pretending to be interested in the superficial stuff, which feels exhausting and fake, or awkwardly trying to bring up deeper topics, which often makes people uncomfortable. You've lost your ability to be happy with just the surface of things, and you can't get that back even when it would be nice to have it. The 10th, and maybe most important, thing you lose is your hope for a final destination, for a point where everything will finally be okay, where all your questions will be answered, where you'll finally feel complete. Before you woke up, you probably had some version of this hope. Maybe you thought that when you achieved certain goals, everything would be all right. Maybe you thought that if you found the right relationship, or the right spiritual practice, or the right understanding, you'd finally find peace. But as you wake up, you realize that there is no final destination. There's no point where everything is finally settled and complete. Life is a process, not a destination. Every answer leads to new questions. Every achievement opens up new challenges. Every moment of peace is followed by a new disturbance. This isn't a problem to be solved. This is just how life is. Once you see this, you lose your hope for a final solution. And that can be devastating because that hope was what kept you going, what made the struggle seem worthwhile. If there's no final destination, what's the point of anything? But here's the amazing thing. Once you lose all those things, your ability to take the social game seriously, your innocence about why people do things, your belief in a solid self, your attachment to your story, your need for outside achievements, your desperate need for approval, your ability to hate people in a self-righteous way, your need to be consistent, your tolerance for shallow conversation, and your hope for a final destination. Once you lose all of those things, something else becomes possible, something you couldn't have imagined before. You become free. Not free in the sense of having no limits or responsibilities, but free in the sense of no longer being trapped by illusions. Free to just be, without constantly trying to become something else. Free to deal with life as it actually is, instead of how you wish it was. Free to love without desperately needing to be loved back. Free to act without worrying about protecting your image. Free to experience each moment as it is, without adding stories and judgments. This freedom isn't what you thought it would be. It's not bliss or comfort or security. It's more like standing on a huge, open plain with nothing to hold on to, nothing to hide behind, nothing to define you. Can be scary, but it's also the only thing that's really real. Everything you lost was just a dream, a comforting lie. And while the dream made you feel safe, it also kept you from really living. So yes, waking up involves loss, a huge amount of loss. You lose things that once seemed important, that once defined who you were, and you can't get them back. But what you find, if you can handle the loss, is that what you really are was never those things anyway. You were never your social status, or your story, or your achievements, or your image, or your beliefs. Those were just costumes you wore, masks you put on, games you played. What you really are is vast and impossible to define, beyond all labels and ideas. And that, in the end, is what you discover when you lose everything you thought you were. Not a new thing to replace what was lost, but a recognition of what was always already here, underneath all the layers of illusion. And that recognition, as hard and disorienting as it might be, is the only thing worth having, because it's the only thing that can never be lost.